Sean, thank you so much for inviting us to Leica Store SF. This is obviously one of the projects, businesses that you own. Can you give us a little bit of background about who you are, Camera West, and how Leica kind of all fits under this umbrella?
Absolutely. My wife and I came out to California in February 2000 and started Camera West in Monterey, California. You know, we set up our first store. Always been a fan of Leica. The things that you enjoy using the most are the things that you want to sell the most.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's very true for that, for our industry as well. And not only that, you started Camera West, and there's a few different businesses under that umbrella now. There's CW Watch. Can you tell us about your interest in watches and how that kind of started as well?
Well, it's kind of funny, you know, cameras are fine precision mechanical instruments, and people who like those things also like other fine precision mechanical instruments. So, you know, I already had some watches when we moved to California. My customers had cool watches, so we talk about cameras, and then we talk about watches for a little bit, and then we go back to cameras, and then I think it kind of really got the ball rolling was, it was my first year, probably my second year in. I had a fellow that wanted to buy a Leica outfit, and he says, you know, I got to sell some stuff first. And
yeah.
I was like, well, what is it that you need to get rid of? He says, well, I got this Panerai that I need to sell before I can buy this. I was like, well, let's talk about that. And we ended up taking the Panerai on trade for some Leica equipment. And that's kind of how it just kind of snowballed from there.
It's oftentimes, I feel like, and I've said this before, a vintage Rolex in the watch industry is more akin to an old camera body, an old Scotch, than it is a new Submariner. I feel like the reasons why people kind of fall into our respective hobbies, whether it's an old M body or like that sub you're wearing, it's that language is the same. The appreciation for time and how it wears on an object, and the appreciation of the history and the people that owned it before. I think there's a romanticism about shooting the same way as, you know, your favorite photographer shot back in the 60s and 70s.
Oh yeah, we look at some of the images over the years, and they're iconic images, and they're basically shot with the same exact camera we're using today, but you know, there's a 50-year time difference. So that always urges one to go back, and you know, they got their new Q in their hands, or their M10 or their M11, and they, you know, what were they using at that time? It was an M3, it was a 3G, and go and explore those things and find the similarities, but yet the differences in the products. It's a journey.
I think there's very few camera companies out there today where you can mention patina or wear and it be a positive thing. Brassing, if you will, what we call, I guess in the watch community, like a tropical dial, right? There's a camera on there which has, I think if anyone else that was looking at like a camera body to pick up, they'd be like, well, this one probably looks pretty beat. Can we talk about this one right here?
Sure.
Here, I'll hand that out to you.
So this is one of our projects that we commissioned with Leica a few years ago. We call it the Your Mark. It's the Leica M246, which is their monochrome camera. You think about all those iconic images from the past, and they're all black and white images. So to kind of carry that theme, we selected the monochrome. We paired it with a 35 f2, which is kind of like the really also iconic standard lens for the Leica M. Also in black paint. And you know, the Your Mark theme was really about the camera telling the story of the photographer, which is a little bit backwards from what you see. It's usually the images that the photographer creates. But if you look at the great photographers, the Leica photographers over the last 4 or 5 decades, and look at their cameras, you know, they're worn. The edges are worn. They're dented. They show a lot of miles. So, you know, that camera really is telling the story about how the photographer interacted with it and the things that the camera's seen. So this camera is designed to patina. The leather on it is real leather from Horween out of Chicago. And the leather finish is going to wear down to the actual leather color. The brass is going to show through the black paint, and it's going to develop your own personal signature.
This is a finish that back in the day, Leica was not necessarily the biggest fan of, because you know, it showed wear, and much like, you know, the reporters that you were saying that would be using this camera, they liked the black because it was discreet.
Right.
It was incognito.
Yep.
I think of that, when I think of that kind of story, I think of, you know, the Comex watches from our world, where Comex divers were issued Comex Submariners. And the consummate professional that would use a Submariner would be a Comex diver, right? This French company that commissioned their divers to go repair whatever underwater. But they were kind of forced to buy, not forced to buy, but their only option to pick up a Rolex Submariner through their company program was co-labeled with their company on there. So when they got it, all they wanted was a Rolex without any name on it, or secondary name, you know. And they would basically, the stories were, a lot of them sold these watches and bought a regular Rolex without their company logo. Turns out, you know, decades later, those are the most desired watches within the Submariner family. The Comex Submariners, you know, 6 figures easily. And I can't think of another parallel with these, you know, these black painted M bodies, right?
Typically, the black painted cameras, they didn't make a lot of them. They were for special order or for special clients. So if you look at like an M3, and they made around 200,000 silver cameras and around 3,000 black cameras.
Oh, wow.
So they're really rare.
Wow.
This is my Your Mark. My M10R.
Oh, Your Mark. So we can kind of show like the difference, right? This is something that is less patinaed.
Yeah. And this still has the original lens with it. These sets, when they came out, I think we sold them for like 14,000, and that's been 5 or 6 years ago. But this lens now on the secondary market, if you can find one, because there's only 80 of them out there, this lens itself sells for about 10 grand. So wow. The lens is appreciated differently than the body is depreciated, but there's not that many sets that are still together, which is kind of cool.
For those that are uninitiated, you know, on paper, people may not understand why you would want to get an M246 or something without color or something without autofocus. Can you walk our audience may not have shot with the Leica M body before. What is that feeling like? How does it differ in terms of a modern camera with 10,000 features?
Well, you know, Leica has a philosophy where they really want to distill the operation into its most basic components, make it as simple as possible. And that, you know, if you've ever operated some of the modern digital cameras, it may take you an hour to sort through the menus to get your camera set up. Mm-hmm. So it's really refreshing to not have all those extra features to worry about. You've got your aperture, you've got your shutter speed, you've got your focus. Mostly that's about it. A nice thing about one of these cameras is that it does take some user input to make a good image. So that kind of is old school thought in of itself.
Right.
So when you get the perfect image, you have really much of a sense of accomplishment. It's more about capturing the moment than it is about getting the perfect focus. And it's very liberating, because if you are really religious about not deleting your mistakes, and you come back to them a month later, you're going to find images in there that you might have deleted that you love.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
You look at a camera like this. This is a really early M2 that I've had for a very long time. I bought this almost 20 years ago, back before they were worth so much. And you know, it's near mint. It's original finish. It's a button rewind, which is one of the first early models, and it has all the early features like the glass windows in the front.
And the button rewind, you mean you have to hold down the button in order to rewind the film?
Yeah, the M2 actually came after the M3, and the M2 was meant to be a less expensive M camera for people, so it has an external counter instead of the counter window.
Got it.
And they stripped a few features off, but the button rewind was a new thing, and you actually held the button in as you rewound, contrary to the M3, where you just simply flick the lever down and it stays down.
Got it.
I think a lot of people complained about that because they had to have an additional interaction during the rewinding process. So like the second version of that camera, they added the flip down rewind lever immediately, so that makes the ones that nobody liked
the more desirable one,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
It's
the same thing as the Comex.
Right.
Yeah.
Or a Paul Newman dial Daytona,
Yeah.
or anything that was. I almost feel like, you know, anything vintage. If everyone wanted it then, I mean, there was good examples stored away somewhere.
Oh yeah.
It's the ones that like nobody really cared for, that no one thought was going to be special, that turns out to be what is the grail, what are grails today.
Yep, the treasures. You know, I think they should all be shot.
Yeah.
I don't think, I mean, no one's going to, and everyone's not going to agree with this, but I think they should be used. I mean, you get a camera like this, I mean, you can use it, you can put 500 rolls of film through it, maybe even put a little bit of your own patina on it. It's not going to decrease the value. You've got a different sense of ownership when you've got actually images that have been made with this, but this camera's got Tri-X in it right now.
Yeah.
I don't use this. This is not my daily user.
Right.
But I'll get it out and use it a few times a year and enjoy it. It gets maybe 10, 15 rolls of film a year out of it. But
That's
about as much time as I have to shoot film anyway. So it's
Sure.
perfect. The first black lenses are unusual because they had brass mounts on them. They didn't start chrome plating the mounts until later on. So when you see a black lens and it's got the brass mount on it, you know it's one of the first samples.
This is one of those John Mayer moments. Look closer, look closer,
yeah.
but look closer.
You know, the M4s have gotten really popular because the price of the M3s have gone up so much, and the M2s have gone up so much. So the M4 is the only lacquer finished M body that's less expensive than those, which is of course made them more expensive. But this is an unusually nice sample. It's probably, I haven't date coded it yet, but it's probably from 68 or 69. Leica has kept fastidious records of all the cameras that they've produced and shipped over the years. They've got these giant books back in Wetzlar with all the information handwritten, when it was produced, where it was shipped, that sort of thing. So, you know, a lot of enthusiasts and historians have visited Leica over the years and made their own copies of the records, and there are serial number lists printed. And most of the serial number lists go, you know, maybe up to the M6, and a few of them go even further than that. And none of them are 100% accurate. There's just so many things that Leica did on the side, or they reserve serial number batches for other things, and you see variations a lot, which keeps the interest very high.
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, you can go online and find the list somewhere.
So we have clients that specifically hunt birth year watches, right?
Yeah.
Is that a thing within the camera community?
Oh, yeah.
It is, huh?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, this would be, if this is a 68, this would be my birth year camera. But, you know, it's...
Well, you're the authority, so it'll be a 68.
Yeah, thanks. But yeah, that's a thing.
Right.
It's definitely a thing. And the more interesting the camera is, you know, getting a black paint camera in your birth year is pretty special.
Can you talk a little bit about that relationship with Magnum and that camera specifically?
Yeah, I wish I had the photos of it handy, but we were, a good friend of mine who's really tied into the New York area and Magnum photographers was approached by another Magnum photographer who had a camera from Henri Cartier-Bresson that he wanted to sell. And it's an amazing story in and of itself, and I won't go into it because it's a long and interesting story. But we had the opportunity to purchase a Leica 3G that was owned by Henri Cartier-Bresson a few years ago, and I mean, what do you say about that? It's breathtaking when you actually see it in the flesh, and you can see something that he's handled and made images with, and he marked all of his cameras. He put little shortcuts on them.
Oh, really?
Like the 30th of a second and the 250th of a second would be marked on the camera, so he would know not to go above a certain shutter speed, and then he could glance if he was at his favorite shutter speed or not. And he'd mark the lenses for focusing points, and he'd mark the counter dials to know when he was getting close to the end of the roll of film, so he could just glance down and know where he was at.
That's awesome. It's like looking into someone's diary of how their brain functioned and how their workflow processed.
Yeah.
And so I think it's the same thing in the watch world. There's obviously a huge collector base based around provenance, and really when you hold some of these objects, even though it could be just like a regular Submariner or a regular M3, there's a weight. There is often an indescribable weight of holding something where you kind of understand the history of why this was made during that time, how it was being used, who used it, and the shots that were, or the moments it lived through.
It gives you goosebumps.
It does.
If you've got something that you know, that someone that you really respect, and you look at their images and they're so compelling, and they're images that you can't just look at once. You have to look at them over and over and over. Every time you look at the image, you get more out of it, and know that maybe this camera might have shot that.
You know, we've heard stories where wartime photographers or GIs would wear nice watches, mostly Rolexes back in the day, and they would take them out in the field, and this was a tool to keep time and make sure you're there for your objectives, etc. But quickly transitioned to, well, this is my meal ticket out. I need to get past the border, or I need safe passage.
Yeah.
And you wonder why, like, a lot of wartime photographers also wore these watches, because I've heard these were the meal ticket. Like this is the tool that captured the images in the story. So they couldn't give this up, but they're more than happy to give up their watch. And for most people that wouldn't know what a Leica was, a Rolex, was kind of universal money at the time. I love how these objects are meant to take photos or tell time, but quickly can easily transition to college tuition fund, or someone's passion dream project down the line.
Right. It's funny you mentioned that. It's when during the war, early on, when things were starting to kind of heat up in Germany, and things were getting really hard on a lot of German citizens, Leica would hire people and bring them in, and they would export them to Leica, New York, to get them out of the countries, to give them safe passage. And one of the things they would do is they would give them a camera and say, okay, when you get to New York, sell this camera and use the money to help set yourself up.
Oh, wow.
And that was just, that's another long conversation, but that's just, cameras have been used as currency in the past as well.
Sure. It doesn't surprise me. And if you look at kind of the history of Rolex and how they've, wouldn't take money for watches that went to servicemen. It's kind of cool how these brands have been around for so long, but two, the generosity and the way they've interacted with their employees, their customer base, et cetera. And I truly feel that today. And I don't mean this to be a shill for Leica, but having shot with all different brands in the past, I can honestly say I've never been treated better at every Leica store I've been into. It's almost an extension of your family, and there's a familiarity to the brand and the people, and they understand why you're shooting with it and where you're trying to go with it. How we met, right, was I had requested, I'm looking for this Hasselblad, and Joseph, our mutual friend here, was kind enough to kind of pass that along to you, and you're like, oh, maybe it's in one of these bins. And I've seen the backstock. It is amazing. That to me is just that collection of used but storied, tools, equipment that come in. That's got to be the funnest part of the job, right?
It's a treasure hunt every day.
Yeah.
It's just, you've got all these iconic pieces, and, being in the business, maybe you've never shot one, so you take out for the weekend to try it out and get some feedback from it. But when you've been into it for a long time, you get a chance to shoot almost everything, and you really develop the pieces you're most affectionate about. And Leica's always been a constant in that.
Yesterday at dinner, we were kind of discussing over drinks about Tudor's relationship with Rolex.
Yeah.
And, we had talked about how Tudor, a lot of the features that would eventually show up and make it to Rolex, double class, with all that stuff, would often be use Tudor as a test bed to test and perfect it before it went to Rolex.
Right.
And there's maybe perhaps a similar relationship between Leica Germany and Leica Canada.
I think so.
Can you tell us about maybe some of the relationship, the reason for the two different factories, and some of the stuff that came out that are now becoming really desirable within the Leica Canada?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You know, when the Canada facility was open, it closed in the early 1990s when it was sold off. But during that production period of Germany produced in Germany, produced in Canada, it seemed like there was an overwhelming pull to people saying, "Oh, I want one that's made in Canada or made in Germany. I don't want one that's made in Canada." And I feel that's a similarity between the really diehard Rolex aficionados and Tudor. It's kind of the same company, but they really just want just the Rolex pieces. Leica established the Midland plant after the war because they needed a place where they could be confident that they could have continuous operations. They wanted something on neutral ground.
Right.
So that was established, and they sent engineers and technicians along with lots of parts and lots of machinery to set this facility up. And some of the most iconic pieces of our time were designed and created there. The 50 1.0 Noctilux, the 75 1.4, the 35 1.4 Summilux, and so on and so on. And a lot of those were only made in Canada. They'd never made them in Germany at all. So you go back and you look at that history, which is, I think it's becoming more known now than it was, 10 or 15 years ago. And there's just so much cool stuff that happened in that era that's not that well known, and that's kind of a part of the treasure hunt too. Early on, we were taking watches in on trade for cameras, and after a while, it would get to the point where someone would say, "What kind of watches do you have now that you've acquired?" And then you have to think about, okay, what do I want to sell or not sell? And
right.
At one point, it just got to the point where it's okay. We should do a website and have a listing of what's available, and so the people that we know and they're in our little circle of watch enthusiasts can have access to, what's interesting that's floating around. And so that's how CW Watch Shop was born.
And I know my clients and my friends and my audience would be remiss. It'd be angry at me if I didn't ask, what are the watches that you prefer to collect? I do see a few Tudor big blocks out there. So can you kind of get us into your mindset of like how you collect watches, why the fascination with big blocks? Because it's I feel like it's such a sleeper watch. But I'll have you kind of explain your passion for those. With
the big block, when they started out, it was very much like a Daytona. It's a racing watch. You see more variations and more interesting things, I think, on the Tudor side of the fence. And I just, they're also kind of the underdog. I think also we tend to have bigger wrists. A 36 millimeter vintage Daytona doesn't really sit well perfectly, or it's not as balanced, I think, on my wrist. And the big block, for a fraction of the money, with a very interesting 90-degree clocked dial in comparison to the Daytona, provides everything you could possibly want in a chronograph, I feel like. There's a lot of satisfaction in there, for sure. And honestly, given the height of the Daytona and the vintage side of these 4-digit Daytonas, it's a well-kept secret, I think, on the Tudor big block side. Well, hopefully it stays that way till I get a few more. Is there a specific lens that's kind of like a grail piece from that factory, or is there like a body that was produced that was unique to Leica Canada? There's a lot of grail pieces from Canada. Well, a lot of it, Elites Canada, it's ELCAN, Elcan, and they did a lot of things for the military. So you've got one of the most famous pieces is the KE-7A, which is the M4 that they made for the Vietnam era U.S. forces. And it comes with a special 50 millimeter lens, which is really highly sought after. And there was, they prototyped other lenses for the system, and other things were built. They have the 66 millimeter Elcan, which is just, you never see them. and they're ridiculously expensive. But it's part of that era. So those are the things that are known. But one of the cool things that's really not that known is you've got a piece like this. This is a 3G that's marked Midland, Ontario, Canada. And the people who worked in that factory, just like the people in Germany today, they did really good quality work. They were really proud of their work. And the people that worked there that could afford to buy a Leica, they wanted one that said where they worked on.
Sure,
so,
yes.
You see these occasionally. They're not super common, but as I understand it, and I'm not the authority of Midland at all, but as I understand it, these were typically made for employees and executives of the company. So when you see those, they're really nice. But this particular one also has a matching 5-centimeter Sumaret, also marked Midland, Canada. And those are really uncommon too, but the most uncommon thing, which you just don't see, is it has a Leica vet with it, which is also marked Midland, Canada.
So all period correct, all from the same, yeah, that's...
Yeah, this is super cool.
And can you show us how the film advances with the Leica vet, which I know that they've had ones for the M6, which I was looking for when I had my M6, but it's the coolest way to, I think, advance film.
Let me set it to a shutter speed here. I typically keep these on bulb when they're in storage to keep the shutters in good shape. And the guys who use these before motor drives, it allows you to hold the camera in such a way as you advance it, you keep the camera aimed at your subject. It's not moving. Because when you do this, you tend to
tilts the, yeah.
So it's a linear motion with your hand. You just squeeze your fingers against the palm of your hand to advance it. But you hear guys getting really fast with these, being able to do 2 or 3 frames
continuous multi-burst shots, right? With
and it just folds back in. And if you want, you can still advance it normally. And the old timers would do it at the end of their finger like that.
There's technique. Yeah. There's technique to this.
Yeah. So that's a really neat piece. It's really hard, and I think it's somewhat controversial. I mean, you might get a piece where someone thinks it's not original, someone thinks that it does, but I mean, you tear down and you look at things. You hold it in the light and look at the reflected surface on it to see if there's any orange peel. The paint was typically pretty consistent, so you look for imperfections in the paint that maybe might not have passed muster at the factory.
Right.
The way the engraving is done, typically these are roll marks up here, and then this is engraved, so it has a different feel to it. You got to look at the infill on the paint. You look at the wear on the back rails. You pop the thing open and see what's going on inside. There's lots of little things.
So if you find like blue painter's tape, that's pretty much dead giveaway.
That's a bad sign. Yeah, that's a bad sign. But yeah, it's tough. Sometimes we'll get something in that we're not sure about, and rather than to put it on the market and risk it not being authentic and selling it, we just toss it in the safe and wait to see if more information comes out about it, so we can. This is an M3. It has an unusual serial number on it. It's number 319. And this one wasn't so much a prototype, because I think it was maybe a factory test camera.
Oh, okay.
For some features they were trying to work on, if they were plausible or not. This one has a really unique yellow window here. And it looks like there's a piece of mylar or plastic behind the window. And when you look through it, it's hard to see, because that mylar was probably bonded to the glass at one time, and over time it's separated, so it's all wavy and stuff.
Right.
But back in the day of the thread mount cameras, Leica made a little filter that would snap on the front of this. It would be orange, what they called an Ocaro contrast filter, so that when you look through the rangefinder, the central patch would be orange and would provide additional contrast for more rapid focusing. So that's my guess as to how this one came to be, is they were testing out different contrasts on the finder to see if they found something that would work, or it could have been, someone had a special requirement that they needed met, so like it was looking to. And
so you have the number, additional number set, right? Or there's no serial on this one, or is there?
It's an atypical serial. Your serial numbers on M3s are typically 6 or 7 digits.
Got it, okay.
And this one's only 4 digits starting with the 0. So usually the things that start with 0 are pre-production pieces or test cameras and things like that.
Interesting, very cool. We do have one camera that is non-Leica.
We do.
Are we allowed to see, or are we just gonna blur it out and let's go ahead and get into it.
Yeah.
I'd love to see this.
Okay. So this is an Apollo era space camera from Hasselblad. Hasselblad's another one of those companies with a really long history. And everyone's seen the picture of the moon, picture of the Earth from the moon, the Earthrise shot.
Yes.
It was shot on a Hasselblad, not too dissimilar from this one. This particular camera, they did a lot of things different for NASA. They took parts off to lighten it. There's no finder on this camera. There's no mirror internally. All that stuff's been removed. The camera fires from a closed position on the lens, which is not typical. The large button on the front, so you could hit it with your space gloves.
Yep.
That kind of became standard on the motorized camera later on, but this is a Hasselblad electric camera, so they called it a HEC.
Okay.
I think estimates is maybe 28 to 30 of these were produced. This particular one does not have, it has the NASA numbers on it that you typically expect, but it's not fully engraved with the last part of the serial number. So I think this one was a test camera or a training camera. It's rumored that Hasselblad did build some of these after the fact as promotional pieces. It could be one of those, but the serial number of this is definitely from 1968, and the body number is definitely in the same production sequence as other ones that are known to have been flown. So it's hard to say, but it's definitely a really cool NASA camera with all the paddles for your space gloves, the big dark slide, and all that stuff.
Yeah, and I was wondering, I was like, why is that dark slide so long and squarish? And it makes sense. It's functional built. You're not going to see this camera being held by some hipster in some coffee shop. I mean, this is something that is like,
it's a museum piece.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're super cool. But this is really fun because, like in watches, we're all fascinated with the watches that went up in space and the Speedmasters and that whole thing. And the late 60s were such a iconic time for both timepieces and photography.
It's my favorite period of collecting because the way I looked at it, there was huge accomplishments being traversed in space. You have obviously the moon landing. You have what Jacques Cousteau was doing in the ocean depths. What Chuck Yeager was doing in flight and test bedding all these new planes. It was that frontier, and these were the tools that enabled our heroes to kind of accomplish their mission.
Yeah.
So definitely a Grail piece. I think we're going to end on that note, and I'm sure this is not going to be our only conversation, but I think this is a great start to understanding kind of the dynamic between timepieces, cameras, old whiskeys. It's all the same thing, just in different mediums.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Sean, thank you so much for having us here. I'll lock up, don't worry about it.
All right.
And just take the day off.
Awesome.
Appreciate it, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Guys, thanks for tuning in. Catch you next time.